I'm just going to try and see myself. Okay, thank you for joining me again. As we progress almost towards the end of the fourth perek of Masechet Sukkah, Lulav Va'arava, that's the name of the perek. We're coming towards the close of that perek. And we've been doing some interesting Beis Hamikdash type Gemara. The topic actually towards the end of this perek is stuff which you almost see nowhere else in Shas. So it's quite interesting to visit because it doesn't deal directly with korbanot, but it deals with the nesochim, the libations, and the libations, not simply the technical rules of those libations, but where they disappear to once they are once they're poured onto the mizbeach. How are they got rid of? Where do they channel to? That's the discussion here, and it's almost uniquely here, apart from some medrashim, which makes this Gemara really quite unique. I just wanted to say that I'm taking a few weeks break from now, and we'll be back again on September the 12th. So I'm taking a few weeks off the Talmud and Technicolor. And of course, everybody will be emailed when we start again. But the program comes for a break, which means that you may all now finally take the holidays you were waiting for, but were unwilling to take while I was continuing to give this shiur. So I've given you an opportunity to go away. Where we're going to pick it up now is the Gemara on Daf Memtet Amud Aleph 49a. And if you're following on the sheet, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I think it's 8 lines down. The line begins with the word zu, zayin vav. But we're going to the final 3 words on that line, which start Tona. Tona debei de Rabbi Yishmael. Tona debei de Rabbi Yishmael. Bereshit, al tikri bereshit, ela bara shit. So let me just take you back again to the topic. And I'm going to share screen because a lot of this is really quite pictorial. Let's see if I can share screen. 1 second. Right. And you remember where this all started? It was the libations on the Simchat Beit HaShoeva during the 7 days of Sukkot, where wine was libated, and this is the wine libation, into a vessel on the roof of the Mizbeach, on the southwest corner of the Mizbeach. Further towards the west to the left, near the horn of the Mizbeach, this is the Gag, the roof of the Mizbeach, there was a similar vessel for water. That was the water that was carried out from the Shiloach, from the pool in the city of David. And it was also libated into this vessel. And if you remember, we said that these vessels actually had holes at the bottom, both of these, and there was a discharge of the fluid. The liquids that were poured in from the carrying vessel into the vessel on the roof of the Mizbeach didn't accumulate in the vessel, but rather there were holes at the base of the vessels, and they carried the liquids down through some mysterious channels, right down possibly to the bowels of planet Earth, to the core of the planet, possibly. We'll have a look and see where actually those liquids went. How far did they sink below the surface of the Mizbeach? But those holes were of such a size that the discharge of both of these kalim would be completed at the same time. They would be finished from the bases of the vessels at the same time. And they were different widths, the holes that were at the base of the vessels, because the viscosity of wine is greater than the viscosity of water, and therefore the hole needed to be wider in order that the flow through the base of the vessel would be complete at the same time as the flow of water through the base of its vessel. So that was the story that the Gemara had painted until now. And the Gemara also gave us a clue that the channels that were carved out, or the caverns somewhere that carried the liquids that discharged down those channels, it's not clear whether we're talking about the channels themselves or some sort of base layer underneath which we can't see, where the the liquids flowed to, were created already at the Sheshes Yemei Bereshis. They were not something necessarily dug out by the architects of the builders of the Mizbeach and of the Beis HaMikdash, but somehow they were God created in the first place. And the piece of Gemara we're going to start now, which is the Brisa that we're just starting, makes this point clear. I brought a very sophisticated source of a posuk from Shir HaShirim, which was the first attempt of the Gemara to demonstrate that the Shittin, as they were called, these channels, or the pit underneath that to which the channels collected, were God created. The Gemara now gives a very simple proof in this statement of Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael. This is what was taught in the school of Rabbi Yishmael. Bereshis, when the Torah says Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz, it's the very first word in the Torah. That word Bereshis could be read as Al Tikri Bereshis. Don't read it as a single word, Bereshis. Ella Boroshis. Hashem has created it in 6 days. No, not Bereshis. Hashem has created Shis. Shis is the allusion to the word Shittin, the channels. So Boroshit, Bereshis, Boroshit, Hashem created himself at the time of the creation of the universe. He created those channels underneath the Mizbeach. And therefore, when the liquids discharged down the Mizbeach, they fed themselves into an enclosure, if you like, in the earth that had been carved out by God's hand and not by the hands of a human architect. That's the way in which this legend, this medrash reads, Bereshis Boroshit. We'll see later on that there is another opinion, that the whatever pit to collect the discharge fluids existed beneath the Mizbeach were actually carved out by the people who made the Mizbeach. But this view that we're seeing here is that they were God created. If you think back, you see that in Pirkei Avos we find a number of items that the Perek says were created at the time of Sheshes Yemei Bereshis, even though they only come into play very, very much later. Remember, one of the examples there is Pi Ha'oson, Bilam's ass. The mouth of Bilam's ass, which was able to speak, which was a miraculous one-time creation, wasn't going to be in employment, so to speak, until the story of Bilam. But in Perek it says it was created already at Sheshes Yemei Bereshis. How do you understand that? Was Bilam's ass around at the time Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, or even before? It's not a medrash we can really understand, but the medrash suggests that somehow there was in readiness for when it was needed the phenomenon of a speaking ass. I can't speak any more detailed about this. It's impossible for us to understand what it really means. So just leave that as there was in the potential of nature created already at Sheshes Yemei Bereshis the potential for an ass that would speak thousands of years in the future. That's the end of our possible understanding of that particular medrash. The medrash says the same for Pi Ha'aretz, that earthquake, or whatever it was, the earth opening up that swallowed up Korach and his many men and his merry men, that also was something prepared for Sheshes Yemei Bereshis, even though it only appears in the story in Parshas Korach. It doesn't seem to be around and about or visible until then. The potential for the unique phenomenon that was the earth swallowing up, which wasn't an earthquake, you have to say that it's very clear from the commentaries, it was something very different to that, was a one-off unique potential that was put into the Bria as something ready to spring out when necessary. But it was placed in the Bria already within the, if you like, it was programmed into the software, you might use that sort of language now, at the creation of the universe, even though its time for application would only come thousands of years later on. If you want to read it that way, you can. So you'd understand that. We're saying something similar over here. According to this view, the Shittin, whatever receptacle there was somewhere in the earth, under the earth, was already made ready, Misheshis and Abrasius. There won't be any Beis Hamikdash for thousands of years. Well, there wasn't any asks for Bilam, and there was no need for the earth to open up for Korach either. Some potential for some very important future structure was already laid invisibly, waiting for the Beis Hamikdash to be built. And this, by the way, is also in line with the idea that we have that even though Yerushalayim was only the home of the Beis Hamikdash at Har HaMoriah, when eventually David, if you like, David HaMelech designated it as such, and Shlomo HaMelech actually built the Beis Hamikdash, that site was already pre-designated. It's the same sort of idea. No one suddenly woke up one day and said, here are the grounds exactly right to build the Beis Hamikdash. The Chumash doesn't mention it at all. We don't find Yerushalayim appearing at all in Chumash, and this is one of the wonders of the Torah that it does not mention it. It mentions, shall we say, remazim, allusions to it. Hamokam asher echa haha, the mountain on which Abraham was about to offer up his son Isaac. But nowhere does it say, and this, by the way, is going to be the mountain of Yerushalayim, the place on which Yaakov placed his head before he went into Choron to have to deal with Lavan. It doesn't say anywhere that these were the Mokam HaMikdash of the future, but our tradition is that is where it was. It was pre-designated even before it was really of any use. HaKadosh Baruch Hu had marked it out, and we can see it from the Shittin that this was marked out at where the Mizbeach was going to be. So this goes further back than Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We're saying this goes back to the creation of the universe or the creation of planet Earth, that it was a pre-designated spot. It's a remarkable idea, but that's the idea that Chazal implant for us as in a way in which, if you like, certain aspects of Jewish history are predetermined and predestined because they've already, if you like, the tools for them have already been programmed into the creation of the world. This is the way we have to understand these things, that history doesn't just develop in fits and starts in a random way, but somehow there is a path that's marked out, and that path was already marked out at the time of creation. Just to bring in a beautiful legend on this. There is a legend which purports to say, why was Har HaMoriah, why was the place of the Beis HaMikdash today not so far from us in Yerushalayim? Why was that meant to be the site of the Beis HaMikdash? So here's a beautiful legend. And the legend says this, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a decision not at the time of Sheshis Yimei Bereshis, but because he observed a particular event, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, looking down from his high place, observed a particular event, and he said, this makes this site ideal for the Beis HaMikdash. What was the event? So the legend goes like this. There were two plots on what today is Har HaBayis, Har HaMoriah, and at that time, no one thought they were any special. One plot, which was fenced off from the other, belonged to a man with a large family. He had lots of sons, he had a wife, and they were a big mishpucha. And they lived in one plot, and it was fenced off from his neighbor. His neighbor was a single elderly man, and he looked after his own little plot, and the family looked after their plot, and they would all have lived happily ever after. The legend then goes that the person who was the family man, he went out one day and he looked at his field and he saw, wow, there's a very, very big bale of wheat, very useful, to feed a family, at the side of my field. I'm not sure how it got there. Maybe I just had a very big harvest. Maybe someone dropped it into my field, but it's huge and it's wonderful. However, he said to himself, you know what? I don't need this bale of wheat so much because I've got a big family. They'll look after me. We all will work the field together. We have enough for ourselves. So at nighttime, he went out, he lifted up this bale of wheat, and he passed it over the fence into his neighbor's garden. He said, my neighbor is single, he's elderly, he has no one to look after him in his old age. He needs it more than me. So he dropped that bale over into the single elderly man's plot and went back in. The next morning, the single elderly man comes out and he sees this huge, if you like, this great treasure of bale of hail in his garden. He says, I don't know how it got over there. All I can say is I'm a single man. I have very little need. What do I need this amount of wheat for? So at the dead of night, he goes out to the garden, he picks up the bale of wheat and he passes it over to the fence of the man with a large family. So he says, the man with a large family, he's got a lot of mouths to feed. He needs it far more than me. And this went on night after night, each time neither party wishing to make use of this windfall that they'd suddenly seen on their turf and passing it over to their neighbor who they felt was in greater need. So the legend goes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu looked down, he says, if I'm going to designate a site to unify the whole of Klal Yisrael, la'ached, of achdus and unity, what better place than this? This is pre-Jewish. This is the place in which somehow there's an environment of brotherly love. And therefore, this shall be the spot on which we will build the Beis HaMikdash. It's a beautiful story, isn't it? Yes? Nod heads. It's a beautiful story. However, it's not a medrash at all. It's often told, this story is told, but scholars have looked into it, have found that it dates back probably to the 8th or 9th century. It's of Arabic or Indian origin. And it was probably adopted. And in fact, the story was in a distorted fashion. It was, if you like, it was manicured into a way that it would fit into this lovely idea. There is no such medrash. According to Chazal, we stick with the fact that it was pre-designated and it wasn't based upon HaKadosh Baruch Hu looking down and finding how good these two brothers were. So it's just a lovely story. And for many people, it's even been quoted in Sforim as a medrash, but it is not an original medrash. Okay, but it's a nice story nevertheless. It says something about the, if you like, the mission of the Beis HaMikdash, which was that everybody should come together to pray, that it should be a place that unifies, not a place that divides. Unfortunately, often it's a place that divides. I just want to, in my Talmud and Technicolor license, tell you a story that goes the other way, which is quite humorous. And this definitely is man-made. So don't in any way think it's, this is what I'm about to say, is somehow a divine tale. The story goes like this. That there was once a plot of land which was divided into two, and there were two families, if you like. There was one fat man with a big family, and the one next door who owned was a single man, an elderly man. Story same as before so far. So far, so good, no difference in the details. Next thing happens is that the man with the big family goes out one day, and he looks over his neighbor's fence, and he sees that his neighbor has a great big bale of wheat. And he said, how? He says, my neighbor's only one person. He only has his own mouth to feed. I have a big family. My need's greater than his. So in the dead of night, he climbs over to his neighbor's patch and he steals the bale and moves it over to his patch. The next morning, the elderly man goes out and he finds that he hasn't got a bale of wheat anymore. He looks over and he sees that his next door neighbor, the one with the big family, has a bale of wheat. And he says, what does this man need a big bale of wheat? He's got 6 workers who work for him, all his sons. They can gather all they need. I'm in my 80s. I'm soon going to need to store things away. I needed more than him. So in the dead of night, he climbs over the fence and he picks up the bale of wheat and brings it over to the single man's regime. And this goes on night after night, each one essentially taking from the other. When Hashem saw that, he said, here shall be built the Knesset. Okay, that's the end of my, my detour. But I think there's a certain irony in the way in which this medrash, which was never a medrash, was then adopted and distorted to produce a wonderful story about how the Knesset may well be the antithesis of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, now we're going on with some serious Gemara. Where does that take us now? We're on Tanya. The Gemara says Tanya was taught in a brisa the following, and this brisa describes through a medrash again, the way it learns a posuk. This time it's a posuk in Yeshaya, which we will study in great depth because we know we like Nach. I'm learning more Nach when I learn Gemara than I've ever learned Nach before, because I have to understand it now in order to be able to explain it. Whereas usually when you learn Gemara, you just smooth over anything that looks like a Nach extract, but you won't let me get away with it. And so therefore I'm going to have to learn it properly. But it purports to show again how the shittin of the Mizbeach were structured, if you like, this underground channeling and pit in which the libation fluids flowed. So let's first read some of the words, and then we'll try and understand, again, a highly sophisticated drasha taken from a posuk that doesn't seem to have anything to do with the way in which the drasha will be utilized. It's a classic way of using a posuk to extract meaning and data when it's not apparent on the surface. We're doing some more data mining from a posuk. Tanya, the Brisa taught, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi said the following, and he's now quoting, he's going to be quoting from a psukim in Yeshayahu, which are a moshel itself, just a moshel, a proverb, if you like, that Yeshayahu is using to describe the backsliding of the Jewish people. But he first of all says Rabbi Yossi, Hashittin mechololin v'yordin al ad hatahom. These shittim, these channels that delivered or down which the flowed the libations from the surface of the Mizbeach, they would flow right down ad tahom until tahom. Tahom is like the deepest innards of the earth. It could be means it's thousands of miles deep. We don't really know what it means. It could be that the word tahom is being used here in some sort of literary sense rather than a physical central spot in the Earth's core. Difficult to know. How do we know that the waters flowed right down? Shenema, because the posuk says as follows. First, I'll just read the bits of the verse, and then we have to try and understand how on earth Rabbi Yossi is extracting his message, that the liquids flowed all the way down through these shittin to the tahom. The posuk says in Yeshaya, Ashira na lididi, I will sing to my beloved one, Shiras dodi lacharmo, if you like, the song of my beloved one about his vineyard, his kerem. Kerem hoya lididi. My beloved one had a vineyard, Bekeren Ben Shemen, in the corner of a place called Ben Shemen. There's a Ben Shemen interchange now, isn't there, or whatever it is, on the road between Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv. Whether there's anything to do with that, I don't know. Via Askehu, and he surrounded it, if you like, with strong walls. Via Saklehu, and he removed all these stones from it, from that patch of land, that vineyard. Vayitoehu sorek, and he planted in them vines. Vayiven migdol besocho, and he built a tower in the center of the vineyard. V'gam yekev, also a wine pit. Chotzav bo, he hewed into it. Right? Those are the Pesukim Yeshayahu. So far, we don't see very much relevance to the discussion of the way in which water libations are directed towards the center of the earth. So how on earth are we going to see this? So Rabbi Yossi himself is going to say, but just before we do, I'm going to share screen, hopefully, all right? Now we're going to travel a bit further. That was last week's. So here we are. I've got quite a lot of the stuff for you, although I highlighted it. But this is chapter 5 in Yeshayahu. It's a beautiful moshel, and we only have part of the quote here in the Gemara. It's worth just having a look at the moshel to see what it's trying to say at the level of the moshel that Yeshayahu is delivering to the Jewish people before we see how it's going to be employed to prove Rabbi Yossi's point about the liquids and how they flow down the channels. Essentially, Rabbi Yossi is going to show you a mashal within a mashal. Get your head around that. So let's have a look at first what the mashal was. If you were living in Yerushalayim at the time, and Yeshayahu was pointing his finger at you, and this was the mashal he was using, what does he mean? So it says, if we go through it, I've highlighted certain words. This is a beautiful song. The song really means it's a mashal. What is that? Kerem Keren Ben Shemen. There was this vineyard in Keren Ben Shemen. In a straightforward way, what this mashal is going to be describing, in Yeshayahu's terms, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has provided enormous scope for the Jewish people to thrive on their land. And he's given them everything they need, every possible tool, every possible luxury. And he was hoping they would use this in the best possible way to be an Ola Goyim, to be a wonderful nation. But instead, they went off the derech, didn't they? That's what every Novi says. That's actually, in a nutshell, what this whole mashal is about. Kerem Keren Ben Shemen. HaKadosh Baruch Hu provided a vineyard. What's that vineyard? Rashi explains all this mashal. That this vineyard is really Eretz Yisrael, a beautiful place where you can plant vineyards. It's a territory where crops will grow in abundance, of great quality. But Keren Ben Shemen, Shemen means oil. Keren Ben Shemen means, if you like, in a spot which is fat, which is fertile, right? Eretz Yisrael has been planted on this planet in a very fertile spot, or a potentially very fertile spot. Vaya Askehu, and he built up, or he enabled to be built up, communities which are which are fortified towns. Via Saklehu, and he moved all the stones away. What does that mean? All the obstacles that would prevent the flourishing of Eretz Yisrael were removed. Says Rashi, it means the nations, the 7 nations who would interrupt the Jewish people, they were destroyed by the Jewish people, so the Jewish people could take over the land and make the land entirely theirs. Vayite'ehu Sorek, and he planted vines in this vineyard. What does that mean? He allowed us to establish our communities, to take root, vines take root. By Yiven Migdal Besocho, and he even built a tower in the middle, which you can imagine could either be the Beis HaMikdash. He allowed them to build small structures. He enabled the Jewish people to build and create civilized structures on the land, or it could be, as we will see later on, it will be a reference to the Beis HaMikdash. The Gam Yekev Chotzav Bo, and also to build wineries, wine pits, agricultural community. Now, by Yikav here means from the word tikva. He actually bore hope. Who did? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Having given Jews the potential to build an incredible civilization, which will be an Ola Goyim in Eretz Yisrael, Hashem had hope. La asos anovim, that from this vineyard would grow beautiful grapes. In other words, that the Jewish people would flourish into a people he could be proud of, that his fruit would mature in the most beautiful way. But what happened? Vayas bo'ushim, instead, thorns and dead flowers grew up instead. It produced this beautiful cultivated vineyard, but instead of bringing up the wonderful grapes that it should have done, it brought up brambles and thorns. In other words, the Jewish people were not the beautiful fruits that Hashem was hoping for. They started to worship Avodah Zarah, etc., etc. Let's go on with the yellowed bits. Malasos od lakarmi, says Hashem Kodesh Baruch Hu, or Yeshaya says in God's words. What more can I do for my vineyard? I've done everything I can to allow them the potential to grow and to mature as a good people, and they've still gone sour on me. What can I do to retrieve the situation? Va'ata odiono eschem. Now all I can do is let you know, eis asher ani ose lacharmi, what it is I will now do forward for my vineyard, for Eretz Yisrael, for the Jewish people who have gone off the derech that I planned for them. Hosem the sukkoso, I'll remove their, if you like, the sukkah, you could say, as if it had a samach, the shade that was protecting them. They will be open to destruction. Parotz gedero, their fences, their fortifications will be breached. Mirmas, and the whole country will become a place of trampling. In other words, Hashem says inevitably the destruction of the Jewish people will come about because they have misused, so to speak, the vineyard, the scope I gave them for building a beautiful land. And if we go further over here, Ki kerem Hashem tzava'o space Yisrael. If you like, this is explaining the mashal. This kerem Hashem, this vineyard that Hashem describes in the prophecy, is Beis Yisrael, is the house of Israel. They should have flourished and prospered in the way that they were destined to do so, given the scope and the tools I provided them, but they have failed me. Vayikav lemishpat, Hashem says he had hoped for a, if you like, a land built on justice, but instead, vihine misbach tzedakah vihine tzedakah. Essentially, tzedakah has been thrown out, and in its place has come shouting. In other words, if you like, the oppression of the poor, their voices come up. Instead of the mishpat and the justice that should have been there, the bein adam lechavero, that was missing. Okay, now we've seen the mashal. Now this mashal, if you like, I haven't explained the Gemara at all. If you're learning Yeshayahu and you learned it with Pirushim and with Rashi, then you might have come out with this interpretation of this beautiful mashal of Yeshayahu. Now, Rabbi Yossi is going to use this to prove that the liquid libations that flowed down from the Mizbeach went underground into this great void underneath. How is he going to do this? From the wonderful song and mashal we've just sang. I'm going to take you back to the Brisa for a moment before I show it to you on the screen. We just reached the words Vayivin Migdol Besocho V'gam Yekev Chotzav Bo. So now he's going to explain. Vayituehu Sorek, and I'll show it to you on the page as well. Let's just read the text. Hashem planted a vineyard. What vines in his vineyard? What does that mean? Says Rabbi Yossi, Zeh Beis Hamikdash. That vine, that precious vine planted there, is referring to the Beis Hamikdash as a whole. Vayiven Migdol Besocho, and he built a tower, again from the words of this mashal, in the midst of this vineyard, which means here in the midst of the Beis Hamikdash. What is the tower that he builds in the Beis Hamikdash? Zeh Mizbeach. That's not so clear. This is the altar. This large altar with a ramp is like the tower in the Beis Hamikdash, which is the special vine. Now, you wouldn't necessarily associate the Mizbeach in the topology of that object with a migdal, with a tower. That's why some say that it should really say, not Zeh Mizbeach, but Zeh HaHeichal, the large sanctuary, tall building in it, which is a migdal. The Gam Yaakov Chotzav Bo, what's this Yekev? What is this winery that the mashal says was hewn out in it, the wine pit? Elu HaShittim. This refers to the shittin, which is under the Mizbeach. Now we see how he's using it. Just take you back. And by the way, just in case you don't know what a yekev looks like, this is not a very good idea. I had to Google for hours to try and find that. Here you see people trampling wine with their feet. The wine, of course, flows out as it is trampled underfoot. It flows and gathers and it goes out through a pipe into this pit, a wine pit. Now, often that wine pit would be underground and you wouldn't see it. But here is a wine pit. And you can imagine the yekev we're talking about under the Mizbeach is some sort of, as we said so far, God-built pit that has perhaps no bottom even, and goes all the way down underneath the Mizbeach, down which those libation liquids will flow. So let's see again how those words are used, this moshel within a moshel. So when it says Vayitu Ehu Sorek, This is straight. These words are straight from the words of Yeshayahu. So there, what is the vine that was built? That's the Beis Hamikdash, as he's just explained. That is the vine. Why is it the vine? Why is it called Sorek? It's the choicest part, if you like, of Yerushalayim and of Eretz Yisrael. It is the centerpiece, and it is the vine, if you like, with a capital T on the word the. Another way of looking at it, they say that the word Sorek, if you replace the kuf here with a shin, you could say it's a bit like shoresh, source, root. The root and the source of all Klal Yisrael is the Beis Hamikdash. At least when we had the Beis Hamikdash, if you like, the centerpiece of the whole of Klal Yisrael. That's another way in which Chazal understand the word Sorek being used by Rabbi Yossi to designate the Beis Hamikdash. Vayiven Migdal b'Socho, and in this Sorek, in the Beis Hamikdash, he built a Migdal, a tower. So Rabbi Yossi says that's the Mizbeach. The altar in the Beis Hamikdash is the Migdal. I said another view is that it is the Heichal, the tall building. But let's just go on. The Gam Yekev, this word Yekev I've emphasized, Chotzabo, and he hewed out a wine. Yekev is often called a winery or something like that. But here, in real terms, it is technically the pit into which the wine flows. I called it here, according to Rabbi Yossi, it means the shittim under the Mizbeach, because he said, it says here, "V'gam yekev chotzavo after vayiven migdal." So if the migdal is a mizbeach, and then the pit is associated with it, it's clearly the pit under the mizbeach, which is the topic we're discussing. It is the pit which gathers the libations, which we've called the shittin as well. The shittin underground cavity is then the yekev. Just to show you, by the way, if you said that the Migdal was the Heichal, it fits in much better. Here's a picture of the Beis HaMikdash. The Heichal is this large structure over here. Now that is a Migdal in technical terms in those times. It was a Migdal, it was a very tall structure. It is easier to understand that the word Migdal refers to this building in the center, the Heichal, which is the Migdal within the Beis Hamikdash, than it is to say it's the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach wasn't small, and it was large, but it wasn't really the highest building there. Okay, so it doesn't matter how you learn it, but you can see what Rabbi Yossi's relating to us over here, that these psukim with a lot of license can be used to prove that there is a pit, if you like, a collection pit parallel to that of a wine pit built under the Mizbeach, which is referred to here as the Migdal within the Beis HaMikdash, which is referred to in the story as a Sorek. Okay, it's all clear now, isn't it? That's how Chazal are using this posuk. Again, is this Rabbi Yossi's quoting this brisa? The brisa is quoting here, sorry, Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is the author of this comment, this whole medrash. He is a Tana, and he makes this statement. It may well be that he's just using this particular posuk in Yeshayahu in an extremely artistic and creative way to prove his point, which he knows anyway. In other words, he's already of the tradition that the Shittin was an underground God-built void. Yes, because this medrash suggests it was there. No one actually carved it out by hand. It was God built, and he's just proving the point by sophisticated usage of drush. And that's one way of looking at it. Or you could take this other way in which he says, this is my source. This is the source. I wouldn't have known it otherwise. I always prefer, when I look at an Agadic brisa like this, to say that he had a long-standing tradition. And given that the Tanoim had incredible memory and scope of the whole of Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, almost immediately he thought of a posuk in Yeshayahu, which to us is enough of a struggle just to get through, and he immediately related it to this particular question of the origin of the Shittin. And he said, snap, this fits in with the tradition I have, that it's an underground God-built structure to collect liquids. Okay, now let's go on. with the Gemara. We're on Tanya now. Omi Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok said the following. This is another brisa. So where are we? Just to get you back again. We are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 6 lines from the bottom of Mem Tes Amud Aleph. We might well cross into a Mem Tes Amud base. I did not actually send you a second sheet. If we get further than that, we'll have to deal with it without you having the source sheet, unless you have your own Gemara. So at the end of the 6th line from the bottom or whatever, Tanya, Omer Rebbe Elazar bar Tzadok. Rebbe Elazar bar Tzadok at Tana said the following. And he makes a very strange statement, which gives us even more insight into the structure of the Mizbeach. In fact, it gives us almost unique insight to one aspect of the Mizbeach that's hardly shown in any of the diagrams or described anywhere else in Shas. So let's have a look. Aren't you lucky to be doing this piece of Gemara, especially in the days of comfort that we have following Tisha B'Av? Ami Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok, lul koton. Very difficult to translate the word lul. Lul here really means a long carved out container of some sort. A bit like a chimney, or it could be cylindrical, or it could actually have been of squared off. We don't know. It was long and thin, but it was a chamber long and thin, which was a vertical. It's not horizontal, it's vertical. You can imagine this this chimney standing next to you on the ground, which has a top to it and a bottom as well. And you could fit it up, but it's 6 foot tall, or it's 100 foot tall, who knows, which can contain fluids. This lul, hoyobein kevesh lemizbeach b'ma'aravo, was planted or placed between the ramp of the Mizbeach and the Mizbeach on the western edge, Shalak Kevesh, of the ramp. I'll try and explain it to you. There is no one ever has done a diagram of this deliberately, I think, because it's completely flummoxed people. So you won't find it in the art scroll. Believe me, you won't find it in the art scroll. They don't even show you easy diagrams, let alone difficult diagrams. So I'm going to try and describe it to you. But this lul, says Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, this is a completely new opinion, was the exit point by which the libations flowed after they entered into the Mizbeach. They flowed down a channel into this long vertical chimney containment pot. For achas l'shivim shana, very, very remarkable brisa here. Once every 70 years, this lul would get rather, what shall I say, crusted up with dried up wine and pits and whatever it is, because it was filling and filling and filling. It had a base, and therefore it would get higher and higher. So every 70 years, it needed to be cleared out. You know, this is an idea. You only need to do spring cleaning once every 70 years. This is the origin for my particular Dvar Torah on this. And who would clean it out? Not the husband of the house, not the adults. Pirchei Kohuna, the little kids, the Kohanic infants, the young children would slither down these chimney pots with scoops and ladles. They would go down, and they would have to scrape up with spoons the dried up wine cakes. Can you imagine what happens when wine goes down in a hot climate for 70 years? It cakes on, and they had to scrape the caking off. And they would bring it up as if they were fig cakes. They used to bring up whole fig cake-like clumps of wine in the process of spring cleaning. These were the early chimney sweeps that went down below to clean out these downward aimed chimneys. Uboin v'sorfen oso b'kedusha. And they would then, having scooped out these cakes of dried wine, they would burn those fine wines. I'm not sure how flammable they are, but they would burn them, biktusha, in a holy place, which means they wouldn't take them outside of the Beis Hamikdash, but they would burn them in a mode of sanctity. She'nema, because the posuk says, Haser nesach shecha, Haser, what is this? Bakodesh hasach nesach shecha Hashem. That the libation liquids, if you like, are holy, they're sacred. And the Gemara is going to discuss this later on, even if we don't get to it today. But the view over here is that even though these are the dried caked up stuff that has, if you like, accumulated over a long period of time and hasn't been used and hasn't even been viewed, they still retain a kedusha, and therefore they can only be disposed of in a kedusha manner, which means very often something which is kodesh you burn. We burn chometz. We do certain things of burning, you know, which represent the way in which you respectably deal with tashmishe kedusha, and therefore you deal with a caked up wine in the same way. Now that is the brisa. Let me just try and work out for you. I share the screen. Where was this lul? Well, it's very difficult for me to show it to you because in the absence of any diagram of the Mizbeach showing you this gap, which apparently exists between the ramp of the Mizbeach and the Mizbeach, it's very difficult for me to draw in I would have to draw it in really at first principles with ruler and show you helicopter views and things like that. No one has bothered to do this for me. Even in the books that describe the Mizbeach and show you all the architecture of the Mizbeach, they fail to show this particular feature, right? This is a black hole in the architecture drawing. So let me just show it to you over here. Remember, this is the Mizbeach top view. And we said that the libations took place over here in the southwest corner. There were like the two vessels went over here, and there was a wine over here, and there was water over here, and they went down some channels which you do not see, but which would have been into the floor of Mizbeach, and they would go right down the Shittin, down to the Tehom, whatever that means. Says Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok over here in his Chidush, he says something completely new. But before we see what he says, which is new, you have to unimagine, or you have to imagine something by dislocating one part of this diagram with another part of the diagram. Isn't that a shame? Here you have the ramp. That ramp, you can see, meets the top of the Mizbeach, the roof of the Mizbeach, where all the offerings were burnt. However, if you look at this diagram, it incorrectly, as all the other diagrams, shows no break between the top of the ramp and the roof on the Mizbeach. It shows no break, as if it meets directly. According to Rabbi Elazar Bar Tzadok, this is wrong. This ramp should come to an end over here, which means if you were a Kohen, you'd have to step over a gap between the end of the ramp at the top and the top of the Mizbeach. Mind the gap, they used to say in the London Underground. You don't fall into the gap. In the gap, in this position, on the left-hand side towards the west, there was actually this lul. There was actually a chimney, if you like, a downward chimney, which was carved down and would go right down to ground level, if you like. But it was a container, and it was in this gap. And if you like, it joined the top of the ramp with the roof of the Mizbeach, but only at this spot because it was quite narrow. Over here, majority of it, there was still the gap. Step over the gap. Over here, between the top of the Mizbeach and the top of the ramp, there is this container hole. And the libations would pour and flow into the container, in which they would drop down into this vertical chimney, which had a base. Every 70 years, because it got clogged up, the poor Kohanim the young Kohanim who were small and agile and narrow would be lowered into these vertical chimneys, and they would scrape up what was inside, right? Well, I haven't drawn it for you, but you have to imagine this in your mind. This is Rebbe Elazar Tzadok's construction of how the liquids exited from the top of the Mizbeach. It's different to ones we described before. This is what he describes. Now, there are a lot of problems with that, with this particular description. A lot of problems. One of the main problem is that Chazal say elsewhere that if there was a gap, it was a very, very narrow gap. And if it was a very, very narrow gap, the gap was not, wide enough to lower even a child down. And by the way, how far down are you going to lower this child? 12 feet, 15 feet? Are you going to dangle him by his toes? Okay, so they say, well, no, what Rabbi Elazar Tzadok really meant is that even though this is a very tall container, because the top of the Mizbeach is 12 feet up, if you like, to the ground level, it goes all the way down as a container, but they would give the kids, if you like, little buckets or I don't know, whatever they are, to lower down, and long tools, with arms, so they could do scraping. Even though they couldn't reach the way to the bottom, they could scrape by the means of tools. Okay, fine. Second problem. What does it mean you lowered down? It says Yordim Lashon. The Pirchei Kahuna actually went down. It almost sounds as though they were lowered by ropes into these small cubic containers, this long cube container. How can you do that? You could only do that if the width of those containers was large enough to take the girth of a young child. And we're talking about an intelligent child, probably a 9 or 10-year-old, not a 2-year-old. It has to be quite wide. But according to Chazal, it may have only been about 5 or 6 hair widths wide. You can't lower a child into something which is 5 or 6 hair widths. So then they want to say, well, maybe what they did is that they only used tools. But they put their hands down, their little hands down as far as they could, and then they used long scoopers and they sprayed it. And indeed, maybe the reason we're talking about young children over here is not necessarily because the young children were small and could be any more useful at scooping than an adult, but simply it was to give the children something to do. We find that the Pirchei Kahuna, the young Kohanim, had other nice little jobs to do, right? You wanted a Kohen's child to feel he was already an adult Kohen. When I'm as old as my daddy, I'm going to be, up there on the Mizbeach. So you give him something nice. And so once every 70 years, my goodness, you had to wait a long time if it wasn't your turn. If you weren't a child during this once every 70 years, then you'd never experience this. But if you were, then you'd have some experiential, story to tell to your grandchildren. I was once one of the people on top of the Mizbeach. But maybe it was nothing to do with size. And all they were doing was using tools to scrape it up. All in all, this additional description of Elazar Tzadok is very strange because it doesn't seem to fit in very well to the geometry of the Mizbeach. And therefore it is somewhat problematic. It seems, therefore, that it could be that this view, that this lull, this receptacle was over here, is only the view of Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok, and it is, shall we say, problematic. However, it's generally accepted that there was a gap between the top of the Mizbeach. This idea that there was a gap between the top of the ramp and the top of the Mizbeach is accepted, not just Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok. However, it's accepted by the majority of people that it was very narrow. Why it was there at all? So some say based upon a medrash that there was such a gap, not because it needed. It just seems to be, in fact, if anything, problematic and obstructive. But nevertheless, it was there. But only Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok makes it so big that you should be able, and to say that the libations actually went into it, and then you needed a child to scoop up. That's Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok. But the fact that there was a small gap between the top of the ramp and the top of the Mizbeach, that is generally accepted. That's called Bein Kevesh LaMizbeach, that there was a small distance between the two. And Bakodesh Hasach Nesach Sheich Hashem. And the Gemara will explain. Actually, we won't do this now, but the Gemara is going to explain. Second, I'm just going to make a mark here. The Gemara is going to explain why it needs to be treated with sanctity, because it's something to think about over here. When something's already been used for a holy purpose, and it doesn't itself carry any name of Hashem in, generally we say it's spent, if I may use that expression. Doesn't need it to be treated with respect anymore. We treat Sfarim with respect, and we put them into Geniza because they still have Shemus in them. They have the name of God. They are Torah. We understand that. Tefillin also. Tzitzis, you don't have to. If a tzitzis is broken off, or got a half a tzitzis and it cut off, you can actually put into the trash can. And we don't do that generally because we're very, very noble. But you could, because it's considered to be it's something which has already used its purpose. In a sense, I think a talus bag might also be able to be used that way if it's completely moldy. So we might put it into Geniza because it doesn't do us any harm, but it does not have the status of Kedusha anymore. Tefillin do because they have the parchments inside them. But other bits and pieces, which somehow are just appurtenances to something for Kedusha, don't. And it's a generally accepted principle, therefore, that if something is used for a holy purpose on a once-off basis and doesn't have the Shem Hashem, it's not Kodesh. So the Gemara is going to ask, why then does the wine have to be burnt in a place of Kedusha? Why don't we just say, throw it out? If you want to treat it nobly, you can. But why should there be a halacha that it retains Kedusha if it's already been spent, if you like? It's been used. It's a chad palmi. It'll never be used again. It's only caking the side and interfering with a containment vessel. And the Gemara is going to explain why, even though that is a general rule that something that is spent has spent its kedusha, is not kodesh anymore, there is an exception here for the libation wines. We will still treat them with kedusha. I'm going to stop over here. I'll stop sharing as well. And as I say, we're not going to meet again until the 12th. I think it's Monday, September the 12th. So everybody should be well. Thanks for joining me. I'm just going to quit recording.